Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Justin Backley. I'm the Vice President of Networks at Ceres. Ceres is a Boston-based sustainability nonprofit working with leading investors and companies on the most profound sustainability issues confronting us today. From climate and water to deforestation, to how financial regulators incorporate risks from these challenges into their work, to human rights. We take on these issues in partnership with the companies, investors, and policymakers that we work. Today, I want to acknowledge before we start the ongoing situation with COVID-19 and issues of racial injustice confronting all of us around the world. And I want to thank, in particular, frontline health workers that continue to keep us all, or try to keep us all, healthy and safe. These are indeed unique times and unique moments for us all, and we want to thank those that are doing their utmost to continue to improve this situation for us all. I wanted to thank, of course, our speakers, who I will introduce in a moment, for all of you for joining us. It has been amazing to us, of course, in these unique times, to see the incredible innovation that starts to emerge from Building Back Better. How to understand and shift priorities within the context of today's events in order to sustain a just and inclusive future for all. So it's really great that we're joined by leaders from our Ceres company and investor networks today. Now, a few short words of housekeeping as we get started very quickly. First of all, we are recording today's session. We'll be sending out a link immediately following the session. Second, I encourage all of you, if you have questions for today's panelists, to please put them in the chat box that you will find on the GoToWebinar control panel. And thank you to the 6 of you who provided questions in advance. We've got those printed out and we've run through them with the speakers, and hopefully we'll get to some of them in today's conversation. Finally, when we deliver these events, sometimes we run into global bandwidth issues. If there are any technical difficulties, we will pause ever so slightly to try to let everything reset and then continue the conversation. So let's turn to today's session, Leadership in the Time of COVID, Building Back Markets and the Built Environment. We really have a number of overarching questions that our panelists are going to grapple with today. Where are we overall in US credit markets? What are the latest trends? And what does it tell us profoundly about the systemic risks that we all confront moving forward in the world? What are the implications specifically of these challenges for the built environment and for housing markets? And what are companies trying to do to build back better? What will a just recovery in commercial real estate and in housing markets look like? So without further ado, let me quickly introduce our speakers for today. First, we have Atsi Sheth, who's the Managing Director of Credit Strategy and Research and the Chief Credit Officer for the Americas at Moody's Investor Services. Second, we have Krisa Pagizis. She is the Vice President of Enterprise ESG at Fannie Mae. And third, we have Lisa Davis, who's the Executive Director and Portfolio Manager of Impact Investing at PGIM, which is Prudential Financial's investment management business. So without further ado, if I can, let me turn it to Atsi, who has been working with her team to provide insights and thinking about the overall macro trends that we're facing in credit markets and what this moment, what we've already learned and the implications for companies and investors moving forward. Atsi, can I turn it to you?
Sure, thanks, Justin. And hello, everyone. Thank you to Ceres, first of all, for organizing this event on what I think is a very important topic. Justin, I'm going to answer your questions with the use of a few slides that I brought with me. So, Anna, if you could go to the next slide. One of the things that we've been highlighting at Moody's is that the COVID crisis is going to shape trends in 6 broad areas in the coming years. And very quickly, those are trends that were already in motion before the crisis hit, but will be compounded by the crisis. So these are weaker growth prospects, lower for longer interest rates, global trade fragmentation, political polarization, and technology disruption. Those are 5. And the last one is a rising focus on environmental, social, and governance risks, which was already in train before the crisis, and we think will be accelerated by the crisis. So if you go on to the next slide, Anna, environmental, social, and governance risks, we know, encompasses a range of specific topics ranging from air pollution to health and safety issues to financial strategy and management. And at no particular time are all companies exposed to all of these risks to the same degree. But what we have found, and the question really is, well, what are the broad risks within environmental, social, and governance risks that will affect a wide swath of companies in the coming years? And if you go to the next slide, you have Moody's answer to that question. And they're in 3 areas. The first is what the crisis has exposed is that those institutions that had good governance, good risk management, seem to be better prepared to respond to the crisis than those that didn't. So I think there's going to be a greater focus on governance factors because we know that unanticipated events can happen and cause significant damage. 2, we've seen now that the healthcare outcomes, I mean, they've been tragic around the world, but they've been unevenly distributed. People with lower incomes, in some cases, people in certain geographic areas, in some cases, people of certain races have had different healthcare outcomes than others. And that has just, again, indicated that widening regional income, racial disparities can yield very negative and tragic outcomes. Again, a greater focus on this after the crisis. And the third, and something that really matters to, I think, those of us in the investment field, is that the approach to corporate strategy has shifted. There's been a noticeable shift in the number of companies that have taken decisions, made announcements that really have sort of been serving consumer preferences, employee preferences, even if those came at a cost to their balance sheet. And I think that tells you that companies are no longer serving just one shareholder, but a multiplicity of stakeholders. If you go to the next slide, those were sort of the sort of observations we make given what we've been seeing. And I'm going to leave the group with sort of 3 very specific questions that those observations lead us to. One is, will the crisis now, we've seen the havoc that the pandemic can wreak. Will we now, as a society, as companies, as people, as governments, pay greater attention, bring greater urgency to other global risks that we know exist, especially climate change? And this slide tells you that private decision makers surveyed by the World Economic Forum have for a long time been saying that climate change is among their top several risks, when they say in terms of the likelihood of it affecting their portfolios and in terms of the impact that it has on portfolios. So we recognize this risk. Will we be more urgent in acting on that risk? If you go to the next slide, our answer is yes, probably, but for that action to have an impact, it's not going to be just one government or several governments or one company or several companies. It's going to be a multiplicity of governments. It's going to have to be a multiplicity of sectors, several companies within those sectors acting together to bring about that change in a meaningful way. And this slide just dimensions the number of sectors and the amount of debt they have outstanding. So the impact that this acceleration could have on markets. With that, I'll move to the second question, which is if you go to the next slide, Anna, when you think back, we all recognize that income disparities have been around for a long time and they've been actually deteriorating for a while. But if you think back to the slide I showed you 2 slides ago, income inequality did not rank in the top 10, either in terms of its being a sort of a cause of a financial market disruption or economic disruption, or being impactful. So the question for the group is, well, will the next time that survey is done, will income inequality rank in the top 10 or not? And then I'll come to the last point, which is with the next slide, Anna. And that is, we have sort of made a statement earlier that, look, corporations are taking action that is stakeholder oriented, not just single shareholder or shareholder oriented. Why do we think that will persist post the crisis? And here you see sort of a slide that shows you the number of controversies that have been created when corporations did deviate from norms of what the market perceived as corporate social responsibility. And you have on the left a list of sort of sectors that were called out for behaving in this way, and then the topics that caught the market's eye or the media's eye. And this sort of gives a negative incentive for corporations to act in ways that are deemed irresponsible. And the question is, are there enough positive incentives? So yes, if you do something that's considered irresponsible, you will suffer reputational damage, but by doing the responsible thing, can you be rewarded in terms of your revenues or your profits? And we do think that, you know, the investment community has a role to play here, at least in terms of financing. So I'll stop there as my sort of opening remarks, Justin, and hand it back to you.
Great, Atsi, thank you so much. What a wonderful orientation and framing for the whole conversation. Teresa, let me turn to you. So many items to jump into from Atsi's opening comments. But from the Fannie Mae perspective, what are you seeing in these moments? What parts of what Atsi's talking about really connect directly with how Fannie Mae is seeing the world? And what has been your response? I think I'd also mention, is just a quick way of introduction, for all of you, the wonderful thing, of course, is a reflection and a through line on ESG issues that long predated the current moment we're in. I think really diving into what has pulled through, you know, what has pulled through others into a journey that all of you have been on in a new way with what's going on. But Teresa, let me turn to you for the view from Fannie Mae.
Wonderful. Thank you, Justin. Atsi, thank you for that great presentation. The data points that you shared with us, frankly, are touching on key issues that companies in every sector are grappling with. Unfortunately, some of these issues predate COVID, right? One of them, for example, is, of course, the dearth of housing, particularly affordable housing in the United States. Many of you probably on this webinar are probably calling in from a high-cost city where limited housing is available to you, your families, at a percentage of your income that you'd like to spend. And it's something that Fannie Mae is acutely aware of and has been working on, frankly, for many years. Fannie Mae, for those who aren't familiar with us and our role in the market, is to support the United States housing market in a secondary role. And what that means is that we actually don't provide loans directly to homeowners or to apartment building owners, but actually to a network of lenders who provide that service as primary lenders. What we do essentially is we purchase those loans in good times when there are many participants in the market, and unfortunately in bad times when other participants aren't there. So we are there to promote and support the stability, liquidity of the housing market, and of course, really be advocates, partners with those who are working on the supply of affordable housing in the United States. Now with COVID, it also raised, of course, the systemic injustice that do exist within many of our financial systems. Again, we are aware of it and of course, addressing it in many ways pre-COVID, but the fact that a disproportionate number of African-American households, people of color, are affected by it because of healthcare availability, absolutely is tragic, and is something that we are thinking about in terms of the way forward. Because the way forward for us at Fannie Mae is not just thinking about that mortgage, not thinking about that bond that we put in the market. It's really about the community of people that live in that neighborhood, the community of people that go to work as firefighters, that go to work as nurses, that go to work and really build the society that we all want to live in, and we want to see go forward positively. So what for us at Fannie Mae, what we have been focusing on really is how do we continue thinking about affordable housing? What are the key issues related to not only the existing supply, but increasing supply? And then how do we, of course, ensure that there's equal access to the loans that allow people to move into those properties as single-family homeowners or even as renters? One piece many people are not aware of course, is just the importance of rental housing in the United States. Again, it's a wonderful, accessible, meaningful piece of home for people. It's home, and we support that as well. So what I'd like to do, Justin, is before turning it back to you, is just really emphasize for this panel and for everyone, one, how important home is for everyone, whether urban environment, rural environment, how important it is to actually have the education, the information, the tools to access a safe, affordable home. And then three, really think about what it is beyond home that we need to build together that makes a community, right? Access to schools, making sure those homes are not in food deserts, making sure that we have transportation, safe transportation in order to access it. So COVID, I think, has really stressed the need for all of those pieces around home and housing. And we together, the panelists and everybody on the call, are thinking about how they can help rebuild or build stronger all of those pieces that create community. So Justin, thank you again, and I'm really looking forward to this panel. Back to you.
Great, thanks, Krisa. Let me ask you one question to follow up before I turn to Lisa. Krisa, are we at a point yet, in one respect, the crisis, the ongoing crisis, probably to a lot of folks has felt like we've been, in an adjusted state now for quite many months. But give us a sense, practically speaking, of how long that takes to really express itself in meta housing trends that you would see at Fannie Mae. Has that happened, or is the lag on when you'll start to understand the impacts here, does it take longer because of the nature of housing? Any way to summarize? That's probably a complicated question, but is there any way to give it sense?
What's interesting is I would say that it's both, it is a complicated question, but thankfully we actually have some initial information to share with you. The good news is that the processes we put in, frankly, after the last crisis, have allowed us, in partnership with our regulator, FHFA, in partnership with our lenders, to actually provide solutions within 6 weeks of the crisis, so that people who do need, for example, forbearance, right, which is essentially taking a portion of your mortgage loan and putting it at the end, right, so you're not paying right now, that has been available, frankly, almost immediately with the crisis hitting, not months into the crisis, years into the crisis. So we do know that people actually have access to forbearance plans and aren't even using them. That's good news. We want them to have those options. What we also know is that homeowners are actually accessing historically low refinance. That's really important, right? A lower refinance rate or a lower mortgage rate allows them to access more funds for childcare or for food, or to tide them over if unfortunately their job has been lost. So those are the two pieces that we're looking to as positive in terms of the housing market, right? Access to forbearance options, access to loan modification options fast, and access, frankly, to refinance rates that supports the overall household. We don't yet, though, Justin, of course, have longer term understanding. People are still sorting out their personal finances and employment. So unfortunately, we are in the, we're still at the very beginning of it, but we have the right building blocks to make sure that that tail or that experience is not a crisis for as many people as it could have been.
Great, super helpful, Krisa, thank you. So Lisa, let me turn it to you. When we talked and in listening to Krisa, a few things that she talked about that I know are through lines in your career and experiences. What does holistic community development look like within affordable housing? What does that whole package look like? And I think impressively with your professional background, you have also run the gamut from roles that are around concessionary grant-based capital and how that works in the housing market, right into investing roles like you are in now. Give us a sense of the PGIM work that you're doing, the efforts that you've brought there. I know there were some new elements when you came into your role for PGIM, and pick up on the themes that Atsi and Krisa have started us with to give us a sense from your view as an investor.
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Really appreciate the invitation and opportunity to be on the panel with you all. Prudential Financial is the owner of the PGIM real estate and our asset management businesses. And Prudential Financial has been involved in social and impact investment and ESG for a long time. And in a way that really does run the gamut that you're talking about, Justin, all the way from concessionary philanthropic investments to purely financially focused investments. And what I would say is that we have a strong tradition in ESG at the Prudential level as well as at the PGIM real estate level. Impact is different. Impact investing means that you're not just considering environmental social governance, but you're actually making investments where you have a dual mandate to achieve both your impact goals and your financial goals. And where I sit, we believe that there are opportunities to make investments where those two things enhance one another. I think that's especially true in affordable housing, and the COVID crisis and the focus on racial and social justice further highlights that. So to break that down a little bit, we have made investments at Prudential, at PGIM Real Estate in impact real estate for a long time, but not with the explicit dual mandate. So that would mean that we've done about $5 billion of investing in real estate with impact characteristics like environmental remediation, affordable housing, and revitalization in low and moderate income communities. But the Impact Value Partners Fund is the first time we've actually had a dual mandate for both of those things. The types of things that we invest in Impact Value Partners are multifamily affordable housing and what we call transformative development. Multifamily affordable housing, very similar sector, and many times I suspect that your lenders are in the same investments that we are, CRISA, in terms of apartment buildings that range from just naturally occurring affordable apartment buildings to subsidized apartment buildings. And then in transformative development, we are seeking to revitalize low and moderate income communities in a way that addresses housing needs, but also the other needs that CRISA, you mentioned. So access to healthcare, access to high quality education, jobs, transportation, parks and open space, and really an overall healthy environment. And what we see in both of these investment sectors is that good investments that perform well financially also support residents and communities. That the best performing investments are going to have an opportunity for people to enhance their lives. When people are healthy and they're able to have access to good jobs, where they have access to childcare, then they're going to be more able to pay their rent in the communities that we invest in, and that's going to be a stronger investment. What we also know about housing investments, multifamily housing investments in a time of crisis, if you compare them to many other real estate sectors, is that they're relatively resilient. Multifamily housing rents are reset every year. So if there's a decline in rents, then you see a temporary blip, but then there's an opportunity for those rents to recover over time. Whereas, an office lease or other types of real estate sectors have a much longer tail and tend to be much less resilient over the market cycle. So what we're seeing right now is that there's a lot of investor interest in things like affordable housing because it has that ability to address many of the social aspects that people are very concerned with, but also provide some level of more resilient income and opportunity for investment over time.
Lisa, let me ask you this as in the way of follow-up. Your point about sort of this spectrum from concessionary grant capital on the one hand with a clear social mandate and the full financial return, and of course every flavor in between sort of those 2 points. And do you find, internally, how hard is it to explain that middle? And in saying that, what drives? Is it driven in part by clients' interest and demand for that, which helps in essence make the case? And as I said, obviously worked on this across all parts of it. But what do clients help drive it and make the case for you that it's an important place for your organization to be?
Yeah, I mean, clients have been a big driver. I think that there's a lot of positive response in the market. People really our investors really like to talk about impact and be involved in the conversation. You know, I think it's easier for some types of clients than other types of clients to get involved in ESG and impact investing. And just to break that down a little bit, I think that there's something happening with individual investors right now that's very interesting. So individual investors would mean, you know, high net worth individuals, large scale wealth managers, smaller foundations and endowments, and then some of the more democratized channels where people can make investments. And individual investors are, there's a generational shift that's happening where younger generations understand that you can achieve both financial outcomes and impact outcomes, and that those two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And there's a desire to do that. And then also there are more women investing capital and controlling capital in the individual sectors. And what the studies show that women care a lot more about investing with their values, likely to consider the alignment of the companies that they're investing in and social values. So those individual segments of investors, I'd say, are really driving the allocations to the impact space right now. And I think that that will continue. That's a good thing because individual investment sectors are growing. Individual wealth, private wealth is growing exponentially. Our traditional clients, pension fund clients, are doing great, but they're not growing in the same way that private wealth is. And they tend to be slower moving in terms of making impact and ESG investments. Somewhat in the US, they're constrained with some of the old thinking around fiduciary duty that I think prevents them from fully considering some of these things in the past.
Great,
You know,
thank you.
I was just, I'd love to build on Lisa's comment. You know, we're seeing a similar, I would say, increase of interest in our securities from a social perspective and certainly from a green perspective, which is interesting, right? Again, Fannie Mae's mission now for the last 80 years, when we were first created, has always been to serve affordable housing in the United States. But what's interesting is that the investors are seeking a plus, right? It's okay, it's a solid security, it's absolutely tradable. Tell me more. Tell me why it's different. Tell me how it's going to do good. Tell me how you have the governance around that, right? You're not just waving your hands saying we're good, right? Tell me about the metrics. And for us at Fannie Mae, again, we are a mission-driven organization. We've always had this at our heart. But what we've realized over the last 2 to 3 years is we need to make that explicit. And I think that's a call to action, frankly, for most companies. I would say most companies do believe they're doing good, right? They're serving their customers. They're actually they are serving their community. But I think the shift is with ESG, you need a framework. You need a strategy. You need to actually have done your materiality assessment. You need to understand your risks. And you do need to respond to ESG rating agencies so that you, again, are being compared to your peers, apples to apples, and you've identified your holes. And so we are really proud to be developing our own ESG strategy here at Fannie Mae for that reason, which is we've got the governance, we've got the commitment, we've got a great green financing program that many people may not actually be aware of, but we're the largest issuer of green bonds in the world. We want to make sure that whole, all those pieces come together in a systematic way. And I think, Lisa, to your point, there are new investors entering the market with explicit expectations, and that expectation is structure, process, governance, so that it's not hot air. I think that's where ESG is different than where we may have been in the prior 5 to 10 years with either boutique or one-off or smaller, meaningful, don't get me wrong, meaningful movements with impact investing or social investing. it's a larger framework that is now being asked for.
Well, and that you and I are both speaking the same language is also significant. You sit on the debt side, we sit on the equity side, and the CORES program that Fannie Mae also has put out there, I think, represents kind of a step forward across the capital stack around trying to address social outcomes. So this is, Chris, I don't know if you've been involved in this specifically, but this is a program that tries to set some standards around resident services in multifamily housing, so addressing not just providing someone with a home with 4 walls, but what else do people need to advance in their lives, and what kind of services are housing providers bringing to the table to help people advance in their lives. And the notion that you might get a better debt, get a better terms on your debt if you're able to do that. I think research that Fannie and others have done that housing is a platform. Housing is a platform for social outcomes, and when the social outcomes are better, the income and resiliency of the investment is also better. And I think that we have seen this very clearly play out in the COVID crisis, and in the raised awareness around social justice. The social determinants of health, as Krisa said, really started home. The people have come to value and understand how important a healthy, stable home with connections to other people in the community and healthcare is.
Yeah, the healthy program you're talking about, the Healthy Housing Rewards, is one that we're very proud of because it very much connects the two. It's not just about a roof over your head. It's about a roof over your head within a home where the air is breathable, you're comfortable sleeping at night, it doesn't trigger asthma, for example. And in particular, resident services are so critical, right? Do you have access to an on-site counselor, for example, or do you have a caseworker who will come by and help you with something related to your job? Again, home is such a complex place. It's a door, a roof, not enough. And we at Fannie Mae recognize that and are really proud to be working with PGIM and our lenders to be offering these types of services where we build that community in every city and rural area within the United States.
Yeah, I mean, this, and perhaps it's at this intersection, the one thing I wanted to raise, and I think both of you have started to hint at this, is I think when you come at housing as a social issue and as a social change advocate, you quickly realize and grasp the intersectionality of the issues. And it could be in the United States, it could be anywhere. You can't just build the building. It's firmly integrated in community. And I guess what you're both pointing at, and I wonder is, Lisa, for you, as you think about clients and making that case, because I think from a social change perspective and how to drive change for underserved communities, it completely resonates that you need this wrapper of all of these integrated services. Is that a harder case to make to investors? Is it a harder story to tell? Is it harder to get people to understand that full package, or is that something that you think resonates pretty cleanly and can be expressed through how you're structuring your actual arrangements with them? I mean, because that's a tension point of a way to see social change that resonates if you come from a civil society perspective, and maybe for your newer investors to the space is a harder thing to grasp. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it has been our fault in the housing industry, frankly, right? Because we have tended to be technicians, and we've tended to talk about housing units and number of units produced, and vacancy rates, and the affordable housing programs in the United States are incredibly complicated from a technical and financial perspective. And I would say that the housing industry itself has really just found religion in the last 10 or so years around this, and developed both research and capacity to be able to deliver on it. And Fannie has really been a big part of that, right? They have a view on the market in terms of scale that's kind of unparalleled, and their research and some of their lenders' research around things that both help housing investments be more resilient and people be more resilient are related, and we can measure them. in concrete ways, and we can agree on them and we can talk about them. So, you know, the housing industry had to get that straight ourselves, and I think we've done a much better job. And as we go out and message it to investors, we have a similar kind of education process that goes on depending on where the investor sits. You know, there is an old school thinking around affordable housing that it's just the projects, and in, you know, those have had a challenging history in the U.S. They're still a very important part of the affordable housing stock, but helping investors to recognize that investing in affordable housing is not just investing in public housing. There's actually various places within the capital stack that you can invest, as well as in various types of affordable housing. So there's housing that's affordable because it's naturally affordable. It's in you know, suburban locations. It's Class B multifamily housing, and that's a great place to invest. There's also housing that's affordable because it's subsidized, and there are lots of great investment opportunities there as well. And then increasingly, I think cities and regions around the country have taken on solving the affordable housing crisis themselves, as the federal government has sort of stepped back from that. And the tools that they have to do that are largely zoning and tax abatement programs that produce mixed income housing. And that's also a really great place to invest capital. I think it also has a lot of advantages from a social outcomes perspective to invest in places that are mixed income, good access to opportunity, jobs, schools, healthcare, and things like that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, I was just going to jump in and say, you know, I think, Lisa, the point you made about the housing industry coming to a realization is sort of a microcosm of industries everywhere. And I think it's a recognition that social risks and systemic risks are company risks too. And I think 20, 30 years ago, you could say, well, the provision of public goods and social safety nets and social goods is a government responsibility. It's not a private sector responsibility or an investor responsibility. And what we've learned is that the government may not be able to provide all of this. As someone who's at credit risk, governments now are just so much more indebted than they were 20 years ago. Two, the private sector is actually able to provide it in ways that are holistic, that the government could not. And I think that's driving that as well. So I would say that this, what you're seeing in the housing sector, is echoing across sectors, in my view.
Yeah, I also wanted to come back. I mean, the first point you made was in the Moody's research that you've looked at. I mean, your first point was that you felt like that COVID will highlight for investors and for companies a new focus on what constitutes systemic risk. And I think what you were saying is basically an ability to reflect on, well, how have we done with COVID? What does it illustrate about our resiliency in the face of something that maybe we could or couldn't have predicted? It's almost immaterial. It's happened. How did we do? And what does it indicate to us, not only about our ability as businesses or investors to react, but secondarily, what does it mean for other systemic risks we might see coming forward? Atsi, how do you see that? Because that completely resonates, and I think, you know, any executive sitting sitting in their home, like all of us now, is running through that exact mindset. How do you think that will express itself tangibly? What will companies and investors do to assess their resiliency in the face of this? What do you expect to change?
Sure. And I'll crystal ball this by looking backwards a little bit. What did we see in the last crisis, for instance, which, again, we have two housing experts, so I'm not going to dwell too much. They can probably offer more insights. But what we saw in the last crisis was the downside of over-leveraging at the household level, the downside of sort of, you know, risk allocation that may not have been optimal, and sort of, you know, the sort of benefits of some sort of regulation, capitalization. What happened after that is that the banking system across the world, not just in the United States, tends to be now much better capitalized going into this crisis. So that was a lesson learned from the last crisis. Stronger financial systems so that these financial systems can serve the economy during the crisis as well, which arguably it is doing now. And two, households delevered following the last crisis, because there was a recognition that the debt that you can carry is directly related to the income that you are able to earn to pay back that debt. This crisis, I think, is teaching us, one, it was, again, unprecedented, people say unanticipated, but it's taught us that, stuff like this happens. Brexit was unanticipated. The last, crisis was unprecedented, people said. So I think getting used to the idea that these curveballs will be thrown at us is a way of life. It's no longer a once in a 50-year event. It's perhaps a 10-year event or maybe even more often than that. And two, this is a public health crisis. And we're, the panelists and I are in the United States, a developed country where there is unequal access to healthcare. We were talking about healthcare in the home, but just health insurance. I read yesterday that the number of people who've lost their health insurance due to a job loss in this crisis, 3 months into the crisis, already exceeds the number that lost it during the last crisis. So I think that sort of access to healthcare and health insurance is going to be a big learning, not just on the part of governments, but on the part of employers as well. I think that's going to be one more. So A, manage unanticipated risks that come from anywhere. B, a public health crisis quickly becomes a balance sheet crisis for any firm, whether you're in the public health arena or whether you're running a hotel or you're running a car company. Public health crisis matters for you. And so again, going to Chris's and Lisa's points, these are systemic risks that quickly become individual company risks. And I think perhaps one thing that we are seeing is the advocacy by corporations, both in terms of where they're putting their money, if the corporations that produce goods and services like hotels, et cetera, or where individual investors are putting their money in terms of investing. It's speaking to that recognition. And then the advocacy in terms of policy might change as well, in terms of what people and companies want from their governments might change after this crisis.
Justin, if I could build, I think taking out, not even just a crystal ball, I would say these are some things that I'd like to share with you that we are seeing in motion now, right? That will have reverberations long term for not just the housing industry, but frankly for certainly U.S. society. One is the acceleration of digital transformation. Now, I'm sure everybody on this call has heard digital this, digital that, and someone's talked about AI, which is all very meaningful. But to give you a tangible example of what digital transformation means is we're seeing a much higher, meaning people are buying and selling homes today without going into the house, right? They're buying it based on Zoom calls, for example. And what we have done at Fannie Mae is really partner, for example, with the appraisal industry and really understand how can we assess a property without the traditional tools that we would, which may be walking into a property, but with digital tools. And the housing industry was certainly moving towards this way, but this crisis has accelerated that digital transformation. There's huge potential for this, right, in terms of efficiency and accuracy and frankly, creating a less costly mortgage experience. But I think digital transformation has really been spurred by this crisis. Another one to think about is preference, right? Many of you may be working from your kitchen table, right? Because your apartment doesn't have that extra space for you to be in a separate office. So what we're tracking and thinking about is the beginning, right? Again, we're seeing it today is the shift in consumer housing and rental preferences. De-densification, certainly something that we're tracking. I'm sure many of you have seen in the news or maybe even thought about it for yourself. How do I get more space? What does senior housing look like? Many of you may not know Fannie Mae actually does seniors housing. We support loans for seniors housing. So thinking about what a safe environment is for our seniors, as well as what does student housing look like? Again, we also support student housing in the United States, not dormitories, but privately owned apartment buildings that serve primarily students. So these are just some of those two major business implications: digital transformation and renter and owner preferences. But then bringing together what Otzi and both Lisa have talked about, it's really thinking about ESG as a way to address systemic inequality, right? Again, how are we changing as a society? How are we changing as a business to systemically address systemic inequality? Because the one thing that we're committed to at Fannie Mae, and I'm sure that Moody's and PGIM are, is statements aren't good enough, right? We will do this, and then it falls off a cliff, right? So we need systemic solutions with long-term goals in order to address the systemic inequality that exists today. So those are the three trends that I would say, Justin, if I had to say, that is not a crystal ball in the future that we're working on today and we're seeing today, but I expect to extend into the future.
Yeah. So just to build on a couple of those, maybe I'll talk about two broad trends. One is in real estate, and one is more of a focus on some of the social and racial justice things that have been in that I think have shifted. I think that we are expecting that coming out of COVID, there will be some of the multifamily trends that we had started to see before accelerate, that Krisa has mentioned. I think we'll see more of a move to the suburbs again in multifamily, and we'll see more of a move to larger units. I think a lot of the investments, institutional investments at the merchant build multifamily level have been in small units in urban areas. And I think we've already started to see a shift in that in the last pre-COVID, and now I think we're going to see that shift accelerate. I still think that it's going to be in more village-like settings than the exurban development of the previous generation. I think when after the global financial crisis, there was a phenomena that happened that we sometimes called drive till you qualify, which was you build as far out as you can so that you can get the biggest house for the mortgage you can afford. And we saw massive foreclosures in those situations. And I think both the financial institutions and families have learned, that's not necessarily the way I want to live. I don't want to drive 2 hours to my job. But also, I think the system is built a little differently now. The second piece is a focus on racial equity. I think we in the affordable housing industry have recognized for a long time that the housing system in the US is based on a large number of racist assumptions and policies. The mortgage system was initially not available to Black families. We have redlining, a history of redlining, zoning. The whole concept of zoning in the US was initially conceived of as a way to keep immigrant tenements out of the suburbs. So I think the dialogue around race and our racial history in the US has helped people to understand that we have a system that is inherently racist. And if we just continue down this same pathway, we're not going to get a different result. And that there is an understanding that we actually have to do things in the housing industry that are pro-integrative, that seek actively to confront residential racial segregation, and that seek to actively, especially address some of the most concerning issues in housing that come out of racially concentrated areas of poverty. And these are areas, ironically, not ironically, these are areas that we know have suffered the most from COVID, and that the solution to that is a public health solution. It's also very much a housing solution, and a solution that needs to take race and racial equity and how that relates to our housing systems and our housing finance systems. So I know that Fannie Mae is working on some things around this. We're working on some things around this, and I think that there are now a set of investors that are also focused on how to do this in very specific ways. So that's my hope that
Great. I think what I would pick up on is one of the through lines here is for folks who have been focused on these issues for a long time, whether it's in housing or other parts of economic, environmental, social justice, the situation of disadvantaged communities being in precarious situations, precarious economically, precarious with, as you said, Otzi, with inequitable health outcomes and so forth. These have been known And unfortunately, I think in part with the George Floyd situation and the COVID crisis have shined a light on things that social and environmental activists have known and for a long time. I guess one question I would have for each of you, and Krista, maybe start with you. Obviously, Fannie Mae has this strong, purpose-driven element of what it does embedded in it. But part of it, I would also think, has to do with, it's one thing if you've worked in these issues and you understand those inextricable links, the intersectionality of all these issues. But I wonder more broadly in organizations, because for folks who haven't been on this journey, like Lisa, in your case, haven't spent their last 20 years working in affordable housing, some of this, I would be exaggerating to call it a surprise, but let's just say it's shown a light on some of these issues in a way that maybe sometimes folks have not been forced to think about in the past. So I wonder, internally in your organizations, do you see a deeper acceptance, a deeper reflection on work that you've all been doing and how these translate into your organizational priorities? Because it feels like in part, the full transformation, and Otzi, you talked about, this move to stakeholder capitalism as opposed to the sort of Milton Friedman version that has driven us for the last 30, 40 years. How much do you see that change starting to occur, that light coming on internally in a way that gives you hope that the change, even if COVID were to pass relatively quickly, which who knows, but that we would continue this momentum on these issues you're talking about? Krista, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you. So just a little personal context. I've been at Fannie Mae 10 years. So joining right after the crisis to start Fannie Mae's green business, right? So post-crisis, no one's thinking about green, but it is clearly a movement that is important and is meaningful for homeowners and renters, right? Lower energy efficiency, energy costs results in lower bills for those renters and the owners. Why I start there is to say that in some ways, while we issued our first bond in 2012, our first green bond in 2012, it took a number of years for the industry, our lenders, and internally, we understand the credit risk. We understand why this is important. It took time because it's people, right? People understanding and it's buy-in. And today, again, we've got a robust green financing program and we're proud of it. What's different, I think, with these issues today is that it's not taking years, right? We're talking that internally for us at Fannie Mae, from the moment that COVID first became a known issue, we moved quickly. We moved quickly for our staff, right? Moving them completely remote within a day's notice, frankly, in early March. We put into place these forbearance programs early on in order to help homeowners as soon as possible, as well as put in protections for renters, right? Protections for them from evictions. So what gives me hope, Justin, is the fact that internally what I'm seeing is that we're already coming together to put solutions. Whether that might be a social bond for Fannie Mae, who knows? I can't, speak to that in the sense of if it's going to happen, but in the sense of we are a socially oriented company, what can we do more to prove it? So I think, again, with that history, knowing that people want to do something, I'm seeing us move from all levels of the company to create solid actions that mean meaningful change for not only the organization, but frankly, the communities that we serve.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that, at PGIM Real Estate, it really has brought home how much addressing racial, ethnic, and gender inequality is the future of the company. If we're going to be a country that's majority of people of color by 2050, then I think we have always recognized that that it's very important from a talent perspective, that it's important from a business perspective, but where we find ourselves now has made that more urgent, has made the dialogue more explicit, and has created new pathways to action. So one example that I could give is that we, at PGIM Real Estate, we make investments directly in real estate with joint venture partners. They're the largest owners, operators, developers of real estate around the country. If you look at what those companies, the largest ones and historic ones, look like right now. They're mostly owned and led by a fairly monolithic group. But we recognize that the next generation of our partners are going to be different. And when I started working, we launched the Impact Value Partners Fund about a year ago, and we started looking for partners. We went out in the field, and the highest performing kind of mid-level of development real estate owners, operators, and managers of real estate were increasingly women and people of color who had not traditionally had access to large-scale institutional capital like us. They were mostly making their investments with friends and family or country club capital, which is not a very efficient way to raise capital. It doesn't allow you to focus on your core operating business as much as you would probably like. So there was a real business opportunity for us at PGIM Real Estate to start working with those partners and to start really developing that next generation of partners that were going to take our business, certainly with the Impact Fund and more broadly for the company, to the next level and to the next generation. So I think that's a really concrete thing that has started to move more quickly recently, I think, as people recognize how important it is.
Great. Atsi, any final comments?
Sure. Very quickly in our last 5 minutes, just starting with an observation. Women exceed men in terms of the number of college graduates, and they have done so for the last 30 years. But you wouldn't know it if you looked at representation at the senior levels of corporate America. And so and yet, if you look at student debt outstanding, women owe more than men do. So on the one hand, women have been stuck with the student loan debt, but not represented in the higher echelons. And Moody's, along with, I think, many other companies, has taken an approach that, the sort of change won't happen just naturally, just by women going to college and graduating and seeking jobs. You have to do something at the corporate level, and it makes business sense. So we've, evolved our recruiting practices, we've evolved our training practices, or we're putting a focus on our promotion practices, and not just in terms of gender, but sort of broader underrepresented groups. And that gives me hope, because again, as a knowledge services company, it doesn't make sense to not have diverse opinions represented in your knowledge services industry. So that does give me hope, and I'm glad we and others are doing something about it.
Great. Atsi, Lisa, and Teresa, thank you so much. What a pleasure it was to be able to moderate a conversation between 3 leaders in the field and across 3 different sectors. Great through lines, I think, in our conversation, but also some just really unique reflections on the moment and what it means for all of us. I would say also in closing, I welcome anyone who's joined us today. At the end of July, on July 28th, we have an evening with Ceres, which is, as you can see here, our way to have a virtual gathering with a lot of interesting conversation dialogue. Mindy Luber, our CEO, with Indra Nooyi, of course, a very inspirational leader from PepsiCo, and quite a journey she is on leading with purpose, of course, throughout her entire business career. So we welcome anyone who can to join us on July 28th for that. And thank you again, Atsi, Lisa, and Teresa. We really appreciate your thoughts and reflections and insights today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.